Well, hi everyone, and welcome back to What You Solve, the podcast where we sit down with change makers solving climate crisis from the ground up. I'm your host, Meera, and today's guest is someone who truly lives and breathes environmental action. So we're thrilled to welcome Erfan Firouzi, a COP28 delegate. He's a researcher and also an award-winning storyteller. So, Irfan, you have worn so many hats already. Like a delegate, a conservationalist, a storyteller. Can you take back to where your journey actually started?
Well, to be honest, I always, throughout my work, since childhood, I always, recall myself as being very lucky for a person who grew up in one of the busiest cities or countries in the world, in Dubai. I was really fortunate to grow up with, an access to nature, connection with the natural world. And you will find that being a bit of a hard, experience or journey to undertake now because of how much biodiversity and nature we have lost. And especially for people who come from outside, they see Dubai as a country with no life. The only life that
Mm.
exists is within the city. But beyond the city, it has extraordinary wildlife, And if you're a person who sometimes can be very arrogant, such as me, you can drag your parents during the hot summers in the deserts. Um, but to be honest, you know, what I see as my journey is someone who doesn't not just talk about biodiversity, but as someone who represents their voice, you know, because I'm a person who has been very lucky enough to accompany my own grandfather in many of his work, and he's not particularly working with nature, but he's a huge nature lover. He has got his main degree in electrical engineering, but when I sat and I talked with him, when I joined him, he always spoke about the abundant biodiversity that he saw, whether it was leopards or whether it was antelopes and so on. We don't see that anymore, Personally, in my childhood, what I've seen also is that you never nowadays ride in a highway and get insects splatter on your windshields anymore, It doesn't happen. And I think what started my journey is, hearing it from someone else of the loss of our planet, or seeing the statistics from, let's say, the World Wildlife Fund, the IUCN, is something that you tend to ignore, you know. But when you see the loss yourself, that's when things get scary and clear, because we have come a long way since 10,000 years ago when we were just simple hunter-gatherers, depending on nature for everything, We now grow our own food and think of ourselves as living in cities and disconnected from nature. But still, we depend on nature for everything we do, Every single thing that we do or whatever we are doing as of now either directly or indirectly affects or is affected by nature. And when you think about it, for a person who loved the natural world, seeing the loss, seeing how habitats such as rivers or springs dry up or decrease in size, or how a huge population of freshwater crabs decrease in numbers just because a farmer or a shepherd takes their livestock there to drink water, is something which is concerning. Over time, when you come and realize that it's not just what you are seeing, but what's going on for the past couple of years, especially since the Industrial Revolution, makes you want to change, especially when you are out there and you see countless animals, whether it is a beetle died of, let's say, you know, insecticides, or whether it's a butterfly dying due to heat waves, or whether it is, something such as a duck dead due to ingesting plastic, or perhaps a pheasant shot near Kudra Lake of Dubai. I think that the main thing was, people have, as you mentioned, I've worn many hats. I've been called many things. I've been called animal lover, naturalist, conservationist, environmentalist, climate activist. But in reality, I would like to see myself as a biodiversity advocate, someone who represents the voice of the natural world. And and breaks that barrier between science and nature and human beings, connects that sort of triangle. So I think that's where exactly the journey began. I mean, since I was a child, all I remember, it was all about connecting with nature. It was all about going and exploring nature, even in the most unexpected places, in parks or whatnot. I was, and I'm not still a person who sits at home, plays video games, or goes to malls with friends. I am very old school, so it was always spending time in nature or going for a walk on a beach or a jog. Not very technologically or teenage life bound, we can say.
Love that. Yeah, I love how you said that since like childhood you have been so connected with nature. So thank you for sharing that. And we would love to hear more about what you do right now because I saw that you were recognized for your podcast recently, and then you have also started another podcast. But I know that you do so much more than that. So we would love to hear about that.
Yep. So to be honest, after I moved from Dubai to Australia for further studies, a bit of the things came to a pause. And I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately, I'm a person who cannot sit free. So there's I do something or the other. Whenever I'm not studying, I go and do things such as, I don't know, go outside for a jog, maybe find some insects, come preserve it. That was in Dubai, or maybe simply read a book or make a podcast. When I get free, I think of myself as I'm losing something. So yesterday my university went into the mid-semester break, so I thought of taking a rest day, but didn't go well. I was really really bored, and I slept 9 p.m., which was odd for me. I always like I'm awake till 11, 12. But yeah, as of now, I am working on a podcast. That's one of the plus points here, and it's a series because it's a series part of Nature Talks. And Nature Talks podcast was a podcast that has got a very odd story behind it. So Nature Talks podcast began during COVID, and it began with online classes. So I've had an experience from people of my age with nature. I have researched on it, studied it. So let me give that to the youth. So I had a series of, I think, 10 to 11 different online classes, which had a good turnout during its time. Around 40 to 50 students joined, including my own teachers, which I was really, really humbled to have and honored to have them there. And we had things ranging from extinction all the way to biodiversity loss. We had detailed courses on those, and we did actually, certify the people who attended them. And then I'm like, we call those Nature Talks courses. And then I'm like, why not transfer this into a podcast? So the first ever episode of podcast that I had was about bioluminescence. Bioluminescence is something that I find extremely interested in, and I think for anyone even not in the field of nature, if you look at bioluminescence, you will be amazed. You will naturally like want to see them. You know, I have been lucky enough to see a few. I have seen, fireflies and so on. I'm not seeing a deep sea bioluminescence yet, but it's a whole world, of wonders. So that was the first episode I made myself. It was a self. So I was talking all by myself. Then I'm like, I have got a few contacts here and there, so let's send a few invites and see who comes in. So my first, speaker was a person named Adam Cook, an amazing environmentalist, and he inspired me, because when you start a journey in especially for youth, you will see nowadays not much people in my age or younger do not pay much attention to science. They're behind trends or memes or such things. But he just told me that even no matter how many people you reach out, if you can inspire one person, it's enough. And I think that over all these years, since I began the podcast and even before, I realized that what he has said is true. It's all about that one person we reach, that one person we change, because that one person goes on to change others. So fast forward all the way till around 2 years ago when I was in year 12. I came to be in advanced diploma degree, so it was a bit difficult for me to run the podcast and do my studies and my passion ahead because COP28 was coming up and a couple of other conferences, a couple of different works. I was slowly trying to wrap on my work, send specimens to universities, the ones that I preserved. So I stopped Nature Talks. It completely was paused for a while. And that was also because I was beginning to work on my own book, The Year Earth Changed, which talks about all my journey, what I have done, what I've seen, and it includes my grandfather's stories as well. So if you have seen my TEDx speech, it's exactly a very detailed version of that. And over there, I propose how we can rewild the planet. So REWILD was an acronym I made officially, which broke down into different words called R was regenerate, E was evolve, W was welcome wildlife, I was innovate, L was learn, and D was discontinue. Um, in the book, it's broken down further into a very detailed breakdown and a guide on what those things mean. But over the years, especially in COP28 and other conferences, I further developed it to, R is equal to, let's say, not just regeneration, but reimagination. E was not just, instill, but also evolve and, innovation, inspiration. So it further broke down. And that the rewild is a motto that I follow because it's a thing I think of bringing nature back to our cities. We are seeing amazing examples out there. How come, let's say, a shark or a leopard, let's say a leopard, for example, is attacking a person in India, but there are indigenous communities in India that are living in the cities. How come they are not affected? Because they are in balance with nature. And over time, I was fortunate enough, especially after COP, to meet a few amazing people, especially indigenous communities, and hearing their stories of how they see the urbanized life as a chemically pampered life. But the ones in nature, you're living a life to your fullest. And I once I got featured in I think millions of podcasts for the 100 nature podcast of the year. I'm like, let me begin again. So I began having, amazing. I had a podcast even recorded yesterday with some amazing speakers. So I had a speaker called Prakash yesterday, who was the lead cameraman for Planet Earth 3 and a couple of other unique nature documentaries. And so we began Nature Talks again. And when I came to the university, they mentioned that, of course, I introduced myself to the couple of societies we had, and one of them was Radio Monash. And I'm like, I want to do my podcast, because this would be a different podcast, unlike us having experts come and speak to you very scientifically. This podcast was to more connect and break down things. So whether it was myths or sustainability tips or things about what we always question, like speculative evolution or personalized stories from youths around the university. So that's how the EcoBus came by. So I got a few friends to join, and sometimes they run it, sometimes I run it. And the recent episode we filmed was about the letter I got from David Attenborough, which I also got one more recently. So that also is going to be a different story. So yep, I think what is keeping me busy right now is just university work, assignments, but along with that, writing letters to whether it is Dr. Jane Goodall or David Attenborough, keeping in touch with them. They send a reply, I reply back to them. And the podcast, along with that, a couple of citizen science projects, because when I first did citizen science back in UAE, I realized how important it is because I was a person who noted down the first documented case of an invasive species there in Dubai. So then we realized how important citizen science is because we lack a lot of information and data when it comes to biodiversity, nature, even our oceans. 70% of our planet is the oceans, but it's very unknown still. I mean, after a century, we just got to film the colossal squid recently, which is, unique. So yeah.
Wow. right? Like it's just wow. I mean, you're doing so much, and I really want to say that everything. I feel connected to this conversation because at Climate Hive we also value storytelling, and that's what you're doing with like a lot of other mediums, like you're writing a book or you're doing a podcast and things like that. So, do you think that storytelling can essentially shift the behavior, or perception of people and conversations around climate and biodiversity?
I think, yeah, to be honest, I've always used storytelling as a form of passing out information. And that's why in the university that I'm now in, Monash University, I am well known for my science communication. So people know me, when I get to connect with them and they see my profile, they don't see me as a science student, they see me as a science communicator. And I think communication of science isn't like coming and scaring people, 75% of, let's say, so and so species is dying out, or giving them facts and jargon. It's all about stories. When we look at it, everything that we are wanting to do is based on stories. You are going on and seeing a movie in a cinema. It's just to see how you can connect to a story, or what does the story talk about. The reason you read a book is to see how you can relate to the story. I think storytelling and stories, whether it is indigenous community stories or elders, stories, or whether it is my story or your story, I think it's stories is something that when it comes to a crisis, especially, not just does it give us hope, but it connects us to one another, because story is something that it has no barriers, no races, no age. Story is a way of connection, and it is through stories that we can spark that curiosity in kids, for example, or we can spark that hope in climate activists or people, especially in the field of medicine, for example. When COVID came and we turned to lockdown, it was a huge loss for the youth, especially, of losing connection with the world. But as soon as the vaccine came, it provided hope. When we heard the stories of all these doctors putting on gear and going out to the patient, gave us hope. You know, we were all worried about the doctors because we heard the stories of what, let's say, COVID does to you. And then we soon realized that that whole COVID story is now being an inspiration for nature, because when the whole world was paused, whether it was Dubai, Italy, or India, species came to our cities, species that were rarely seen. And for the first time, our air population dropped down the huge percentages during COVID. So I think it's a way that we all can connect in the crises. And again, if you look at it, you have connected me for a story. I've connected you to a story. We are connecting with people like Dr. Jane Goodall for stories. And stories is something which makes us care. Because whether it is visual storytelling, like I was talking about yesterday, or whether it is audio storytelling, or just connecting with people through stories, it's it sparks that emotion in people. Whether the times when I've spoken to kids or presented specimens to them and see them cry, all the way to when adults was just having to question their mind. It sparks the care and understanding, because people talk about, let's protest, let's have a petition, let's do activism for climate, let's do advocacy. But the main question is, why should I care? You know, even right now, Meera, I know you're living in Dubai. You are living in a city where you go outside, it's just towering buildings. The only animals you see are pigeons and cats. You know, if I come and tell you like about polar bears, you'd be like, why should I care? You know, even if I come and tell you the facts, so and so percent of polar bears are dying every year, the poles are melting. I don't live in the poles. Why should I care? You know, but when you tell that through a story, for example, connecting the story of a mother and a cub to a mother and a baby, you realize that things are going down. As ice melts, the sea levels rise, because of the seas expanding, and the climate becomes warmer, whether we are going to get more risks of natural hazards, and there is this plastic pollution to cancers. We know that we'll be affected at the end. And the same way that the polar bear is struggling to get food for its cub or struggling on a sea ice with its cub, you as a mother are going to struggle to support your child's future. And that's where the care comes in. So I think it's first understanding, which is comes from storytelling, and connecting with the story, which comes care. Once you care, you can finally want to take action for the planet.
Yeah, you're right. Right? The main part of a conversation, or something that we need to communicate, is why you should care. And that's very important. And so thank you for sharing that. Um, well, I think that my other question would be that you were a delegate for, COP28, and that's a huge milestone. So congratulations. Um,
Thank you.
but, what was the experience like for you as a young climate leader? And how do you see young people shaping the future of climate policies?
I mean, to be honest, again, many, as a youth, many youths are there out there, that are doing amazing work. I've been fortunate enough to connect and work with a lot of them in amazing fields, especially through organization I'm a youth council of called Reserva. But I think the main question is there are a couple of groups out there, the youth that talks about the climate and knows what they're talking about through experience and through research. They've got youth that have lost hope and are just talking because of climate anxiety. And there are youth that are just talking about climate change and so on to seek fame and awareness. All these youth are doing amazing work. And to be honest, when you just enter COP28, previously you hear a lot of things, that COPs are a waste of time, they are, not true, or they're fake. But when you enter the whole, environment, you realize that there are people who are, especially indigenous people, who are very, very passionate, very, understanding of the proper crises. That even personally myself, I have no understanding of such an extent of a crisis, of, let's say, what will happen if a species go extinct. And most of our nature-based solutions comes from indigenous knowledge. And I think personally, when we talk about COP28, it was a really unique opportunity because I got to represent the UAE youth as a whole, but I also got to present the youth for biodiversity. Because, COP28 is a sort of climate change conference. It's they don't talk about biodiversity much. And I was really happy that I was a person who had a couple of sessions both in the blue and green zone to talk about biodiversity. Because, it is it is getting late, but we have finally realized that climate change and biodiversity are twin problems. You cannot address one without the other. And personally, I believe that we would not have the climate crisis if we had enough biodiversity to fight against climate change and capture that carbon.
I think one of my last questions would be that if our listeners could take away one lesson from your journey so far, what would it be?
I think to be the fact that, don't give up. Always have hope, you know. Now, a person might come to me and tell him, how come you have never been hopeless or, about to give up in your life? I have been, you know. A day without challenges isn't a day, in my point of view. Challenges can come in many different forms, whether you're hearing a sad news, struggling with an assignment, or simply, let's say, getting a flu. It's every day is a challenge. Living in a noisy city is a challenge. When you go to a natural world outside and you relax and you see that it's so peaceful, no noise, no cars honking, no, you know, it's a very peaceful world. Then you realize, yeah, when you that's what I'm saying, it's all about connecting with nature. Once again, we come back to the same point. when you go and connect yourself with nature, even through watching documentaries, you see that those majestic lions, majestic birds, majestic, antelopes, when they start as young, they cannot even walk properly. Every day for them is a challenge. You know, we humans are very lucky that we don't need to fight for our lives every day. We don't need to run from predators. The only thing we are doing is just either as a youth studying or working or doing something of such. We don't have those struggles that we see in the natural world. So, when we're not having those struggles, we cannot lose hope, and it's all about following your passion and your dreams. For a person going, especially from in Asia, if you're going to go in a field of nature or science, if it's not medicine, they will either see you as a wet or see you as a waste of time or something. But I feel like it's all about, following your dreams and never giving up. Because, everyone that I know who has been out there, who has now reached their dream, is about never giving up. And whenever you achieve those micro dreams, keep dreaming, The good thing about the human mind is we can always keep dreaming, And I can tell you countless reasons on not to give up and not to lose hope, but that will take days. But one biggest example is the reason you shouldn't lose hope is to see examples like, role models, like people who have already achieved something great, like Dr. Jane Goodall or Sir David Attenborough, If you look at Dr. Jane Goodall, right, she has been through World War II. The reason, the way she studied chimpanzees is all with challenges. She studied chimpanzees without having a bachelor's degree. She straight away went to, PhD, and that was how, through not giving up on her dreams and finally finding a connection and, let's say, becoming a secretary of someone, so she was a secretary at first, and that person saw the passion in her and connecting with her to otherwise, It's all about never giving up, to be honest. It's something which they can learn from me is never giving up at all, Even when you're sick, even when you're upset, everywhere when you see all the stories, it's about never giving up. Stephen Hawking, the leading astrophysicist, he didn't give up. They told him that you have only got a couple of months to live, but he lived up to 71 years, He didn't give up. So I think, yeah, don't give up.